Hey guys, welcome to the Mom Show. I'm your host, Courtney Doyle, and this is a place I am giving you permission to not have it all together. Today's episode, my guest is Patricia Cameron, a mom whose life was turned upside down the day her husband collapsed unexpectedly, leaving her to raise 3 boys on her own. What followed was a journey through deep grief, hard questions, and unimaginable loss, but also unexpected joy. In this powerful episode, Patricia shares how God met her in the chaos, how community became the hands and feet of Jesus, and how joy began to return in the most ordinary of moments. Whether you're walking through grief, loss, or just feel like life hasn't turned out the way you thought it would, Patricia's story will remind you that you're not alone and that Jesus really can bring life even after the darkest seasons. Here's my friend, Patricia. Hey guys, welcome back to the show. My guest today is Patricia Cameron, and as we are doing Help, I'm a mom who, and I'm letting my guest fill in the blank. Patricia, you're up.
Okay, I am a mom whose world turned upside down one morning when my husband collapsed on the high school track. Our boys were 13, 10, and 8 at the time. I remember telling them to pray, believing that God would heal him, and they fully expected him to do so. But that was not our story. He passed away 5 days later.
Were y'all on the track together as a family?
No, he had gone to run and work out with some friends from work. And so our friends, his boss, who was also our neighbor, he and his wife showed up at my door to tell me we needed to go to the hospital. And so they rushed me there.
And so how old was your husband when that happened? Because your boys were pretty young.
Yeah, he was 45. So he was
Wow.
pretty young.
Any health issues prior to this? Was there any warning that something was not right?
No, there was no warning. He was diabetic, but they assured me at the hospital that was not the cause, that it was just an electric event that caused it. And the bottom line was that there was just too much oxygen to the brain between the time he collapsed and when they got support for him.
Wow.
But they did every test in the book to try to determine if there was any brain activity. In the end, there wasn't. Anyway.
At 45, and now you've got 3 young children that have prayed for a miracle. God heal my daddy, and that's not the situation. Let me ask you this. How did this impact your identity as a mom in this moment?
I will first say that I am no stranger to grief. I had several things happen in my life prior to this, but this turned my world upside down. I had a dad that had a debilitating accident when I was 5. He lost both legs in that accident. And he taught me that overcoming obstacles was just something you did. He's 92 today. I was heartbroken over a unwanted divorce when I was 25, and I grieved that for years. And my nephew was brutally beaten and murdered when he was 6 by a stepfather. And we also suffered 4 miscarriages and an infant death of our daughter. She died at birth, and we knew that because of a condition she had, she would not live once she was born. But we had 4 miscarriages and then that, and then I lost my best friend to cancer after a 5-year battle. But like I said, when my husband passed away, my world was just upside down. I was thrown into an environment where I had no clue what to do. I had felt all joy had just been sucked right out of my life. And quickly, as most moms do, went into survival mode. Taking care of the boys, managing the house, keeping up with work tasks and schedules, trying to keep our lives as normal as possible.
Yeah.
And that's a little difficult. Things were not normal at home. And so we survived through that. But there came a point when I was so overwhelmed that I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. There were decisions to make, tasks needing attention, and it was all up to me. I remember thinking that I have to do all this myself.
Yeah.
But we were almost at that 1 year mark. We had passed all the milestones except for that 1 year.
Mm.
But that was when at that time, God used a group of women to help me heal. Until that point, I was just going through the motions. But
Yeah, that's what I was
like,
gonna ask. I don't wanna interrupt you, but you
yeah,
mentioned several really traumatic situations, things that your father, your friend, a divorce. I bet if somebody had asked you prior to your husband passing if you knew how to get through something really difficult or you knew how to grieve well, correct me if I'm wrong, Patricia, but I feel like you probably would have been like, I know how to do this thing. I know what I'm doing because that was a lot. What you just shared of very difficult circumstances that you had experienced prior to his passing. So I feel like you may have been like, I can do this. I can get through really hard things. But what you're saying is this was different
it was
and this
different.
was much harder than anything you had expected. Take me back before we go forward. What did grief look like in those early days with 3 boys and the loss of your husband?
It felt a little chaotic. Like I said, we were just really busy. But I did have people who stepped in and helped us and provided for us. Had a friend helping a friend, actually he was our pastor at the time. He offered to help me come up with a budget, how to figure out our financial situation, so he helped
Yeah.
me with that. I had a another guy that came by that he had a ministry to widows, which we all hate that word. Nobody wants to be called a widow, but he would come by and mow our lawn. And he said, "Until your boys learn how to do it, I will
Mm.
do it." And so he did for about a year, and he taught my boys how to mow.
Wow.
So I again, people like him stepped in. I had a few neighbor that our backyard bumped up to his side yard, and he would come over it unexpectedly, and he would just bring me a bag of white perch fish. Oh, and he's like, "Went fishing today." And so I learned how to cook white perch because, of his gesture, and matter of fact, he told me how to cook it, but and my boys loved it. So,
Yeah.
again, those are those seem small, but they were just, again, like those women at that retreat, they were the hands and feet of Jesus. I had another friend, I didn't really know her very well at the time, but now she's a good friend, and she's helped me on both my book launches. But she just would bring us something for every holiday, especially Father's Day. She always would brought us chocolates or just something that we could enjoy as a family. So I experienced people like that just being Jesus to us. So,
Wow.
but as far as them, some of it I didn't even realize at the time because they didn't share a lot early on. But it was years later when I realized my oldest had been going through something very specific. And then later on, I realized my youngest had been going through something I had no idea. It's not something that takes place really quickly. It's
Yeah.
over time, and now we're in a much better place, of course, but
Yeah.
it's hard to see everything in the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. When you started to realize that the kiddos were struggling in different manners, did you ever find yourself blaming yourself for not seeing it all and not
Oh,
being able
yeah.
to do it all? Of course, then spiraling you into another set of grief, really?
Yeah. I took them to counseling, and they hated it. My
Yeah, of
oldest was
course.
like, "No way, I'm not doing this again. I'll never do that again." But every time I talked to a counselor, it all went back to the fact that his daddy died.
Mm.
So anything that was going on in his life that was a struggle, that was a problem, that's what they all said. It's because
Yeah.
he lost his dad. You don't, although people were good to us, that no one could replace that.
Right.
There's just a void in our lives, and he wasn't there.
Mhm.
But yeah, I
Mhm.
felt so inadequate, and I felt like I couldn't do anything right for a time. But matter of fact, though, one of the things I've reflected on recently, and it's because God was with us, and even in spite of all my failures, my boys, I'm so proud of them because they've turned out so well. And I just, like I said, because you don't know at the time, all you can see is the failure, but
Yeah.
then God fills in that void,
Mm.
and they're all good boys.
Yeah. No. Don't
Yeah.
be sorry. Don't be sorry. And you realize that regardless of what we're facing as moms,
Yeah.
we're human. We all are
Yeah.
falling short and we're all going to make mistakes. And then God's like, I've got this. I've got
Yeah.
them. So you're saying that you felt like you were struggling in motherhood, of course, after this loss. What are some of the lies that you were believing about yourself and about being a mom? What were some of the lies that you were hearing? And then I'm going to ask you, after you tell me the lies, what was the truth that God spoke to you in those places? So
Oh,
let's start
wow.
with the lies.
Okay. When I married Matthew, I had been through a lot already before. I remember thinking, surely nothing else is going to happen to me because I've already been through so much. But
Yeah.
Matthew, he'd never really been through any kind of trial that I knew of. And so I thought, if something's going to happen, he's going to be in the trial.
Yeah,
This,
you've done
this
the
is
trial, right?
this
I've
is
checked
weird
that box,
thinking. This
Lord.
is strange thinking, I know. And I do remember in our marriage, I remember thinking, gosh, if something happened to me, he's going to be fine. He is self sufficient. He's strong. He's got it together. And I remember thinking, if anything ever happened to him, I wouldn't be able to handle it. And then here I was having to handle it.
Mm,
But I guess I tried so hard to say all the right things and do all the right things. And I think the lie that I believed was that I had to be the one to do everything.
mm,
I had to provide everything they needed to grow up. And like I said earlier, God's the one that filled in the places that I couldn't meet. And one of the things that early on, the day I told my boys their daddy had gone to be with Jesus, that's what I said. I said, Daddy's gone to be with Jesus. And they had no clue what I was talking about. I mean, it did sink in. But the way I said it, they thought, again, because I said, let's pray. We're going to pray believing because the Bible tells us to do that. And they thought he was going to come home one day. But I did tell them that things weren't looking good. I said that the doctors don't think he's going to be able to make it, but that we should still pray, believe it. But when I did share with them the news, my oldest stalked off and I thought I was going to hit something.
mm.
My middle child was completely quiet, didn't say anything. And my youngest, who's the outspoken one, said, no, I don't want to be a family of 4.
Oh,
And for many years after that, every time we talked about doing a family trip or a family event, he said, we can't do that because Daddy's not here. Anyway,
yeah.
but I did
That's,
learn I couldn't do everything.
yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a message for any mom that's listening, whether you're
Yeah.
in a season of grief or not. You can't do it all. You
Yeah.
can't do it all. And we will kill ourselves trying to do it all.
Yes, we will.
And so I think that's such a great lesson for all of us to hear. What has been what has been your greatest source of strength over the years?
The only thing that comes to my mind right now is just my faith in the Lord. Through my trials, He has changed me. He's moved me forward to a new purpose. That I mentioned that women's retreat,
Yeah.
that was a pivotal point in my life where where I began to heal. God used people to help me heal.
Yeah, tell us about
And
that because we were started in that and then we kind of
yeah,
backed up a little bit. So let's go back. It's been a year and you're headed to a retreat. Tell us
yes.
what happens at the retreat.
And I didn't know whether I was supposed to go. And I had asked a friend of mine if they still had openings, and she said no. But she said, if they have an opening, I'll call you. And so 2 days later, she called me and said, they have a spot. Do you want to go? You have till tomorrow morning to let me know. And so the next morning, I was sitting there praying, do I go? I mean, I hadn't left the boys before.
Yeah, I was about to say that's got to
Yeah,
be a hard decision. You haven't
yeah,
left the boys, I bet.
hadn't left them. And literally that day, I was on my porch praying that I was like, I just need to know for sure. And in seconds, another friend called me who was also going to be at that retreat. And she said, hey, I heard you might be joining us for the retreat. I sure hope you can come. And I thought,
Mhm.
that was quick, Lord. That
Yeah.
was a
Yeah.
that was a fast response.
I love it when he responds fast. It's when he doesn't that I'm like, come on, God.
But, even though sometimes we feel we're going and doing what we're supposed to be doing, Satan puts that little piece of doubt in our minds.
Of course.
And so the day of the retreat, I'm literally 20 minutes from driving to the church to get on a bus to go hour or so away. And my son and a friend were jumping on the trampoline and had a collision.
Oh, no.
And literally come to me, and one has a bloody head and the other one has a bloody mouth. So my son's mouth hit the kid's forehead. And I'm
Oh,
like,
gosh.
what do I do? My
Yeah.
parents were there to pick up the boys. And so I still went. But I'm like, that was a real distraction. And I'm on the bus trying to talk to the dentist as my kid's gonna lose his tooth. So
Yeah.
the other boy ran off to his house. I didn't know his parents. And so I'm feeling terrible about that, of course. But anyway, to say all that Satan is trying to keep us from those kinds of moments where
Sure.
God provides healing and comfort and a way forward.
Yeah. I remember being at a retreat one time, and I didn't leave often either because we had, at the time, we had 5 children. So it was hard for me to leave.
Yeah, imagine.
And so I can't even imagine being a single mom and having to organize leaving the 3 kids. I wasn't paying attention to my phone, and it had
Mm.
been ringing and ringing. Well, my husband was home with the kids, but our girls were going to a sleepover with my best friend from high school. And it was really a sleepover for the older girl, and when I say older, they were, oh, I don't know, maybe 6 and 7. They were young, but this
Mhm.
was like the only place I would let kids that young go spend the night. They're best friends. We had girls the same age, and she was my best friend in high school. I look at the phone at some point and I've missed all these calls from my friend, and I'm thinking, what is happening? So I'm frantically trying to figure out in the middle of worship, in the middle of 10,000
Mhm.
women, and one of our girls, they were all doing cartwheels and back bends and things like that. And the youngest had done a little back bend and her arm hurt. And so she cried and cried and wanted her mama. I'm hours away. And now I'm not even a phone call away because I'm not answering my phone. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Like the guilt that you feel, but it's only going to happen when you're not present. So,
Right.
but then you can't be paralyzed and be present all the time either. And so
Right.
I can just imagine how you were feeling driving off in that bus, knowing that there's some random kid that's hurt, your kid's hurt. Now your parents are having to do all the things. It's a lot. It is a
Yeah.
lot. But what happens at the retreat? Let's go back to that.
These women minister to me in a way I'd never known before. And what I learned was that everyone has something happening or will have something devastating happen in their lives. We just may not always see it in the moment, but in the moment, we feel like we're the only one. I
Mm.
left there knowing that I was not alone, that other people had experienced very tragic circumstances as well.
Yeah.
Not just like mine, but still tragic
Mhm.
all the same. And that God used that as to change me and to move me forward and place a new purpose in my heart. At the time, I didn't know. The time I left there, I want to write down my story. I don't know if I'll ever use it, but I want to write it down. And I wanted to be able to use my story to help someone else walk in the same. I wanted to be like those women. I wanted to be serving someone else. And that was
Mhm.
my heart at the time. But then a couple years later, God used that I felt a stirring in my heart to start to write a book. And so that's where that led. But it's all started at women being the hands and feet of Jesus and ministering to
Mhm.
me in a real time of need.
Yeah. And so you wrote your first book. Tell us the title of that.
That's called Grief Unwrapped, Discovering Joy in a Season of Sorrow. It's about finding a deep rooted joy through a relationship with Jesus Christ. And although bad things happened, there are moments of joy that we can have, and that although it doesn't change the circumstances, we can still have that deep down joy in our hearts. Not
Yeah.
happiness necessarily, but joy.
Yeah. When did you begin to see joy returning to your life after your husband's passing?
Wow, I hadn't thought about that. I can remember a lot of moments of joy because whether I was really joyful myself, I was trying to be joyful for my children. I tried to do everything. We tried to take trips. And the first Christmas, it was 3 months after he passed away. And that was a
Mm.
big My husband loved Christmas. We always made a big deal of Christmas. And a couple of my boys played soccer. And so I bought them if you've ever seen the big bubble balls, or they're like shaped like a soccer ball, but they're just you
Mhm.
fill it with air that they wrap, you get inside them and then you can like bounce around the yard and stuff.
Oh, fun.
So it's a favorite memory of mine. But I bought the 3, and my oldest son was 6 foot tall at the time. He's just very tall, and so he had to get an adult size ball. But anyway, so I have them all in the front yard. It'd been raining, and so they all have these bubble balls on them, and they're bouncing around and ricocheting off each other, and then my oldest is so big, so he's, like, knocking everybody over,
Yeah.
and my youngest ends up on the ground laying down, and he can't get up. He's like, "I can't get up. I can't get up." And so anyway, it was just fun, and all of our neighbors stopped to see what the commotion was, and so
Yeah.
literally I was trying to bring joy to an otherwise down day, but the
Yeah.
whole neighborhood got into it and watched us
Mm.
play, and so it was a cool memory.
Yeah. And I think that there's something about a child's joy that
Yeah.
can spark that joy in us too. Because as a mom who's lost her spouse, you've lost your children's father, you are carrying the weight of that grief. And so to be able to recognize those moments that these children are bringing joy, their laughter is bringing joy, and reminding ourselves that even in the grief, we can still have
Yeah.
joy and we can have moments. And initially, it may take a while. You and I talked before we started. I'm interviewing you on the heels of losing both of my parents in the last 5 months. And so I understand that it's this juxtaposition of, do I feel sad or do I feel happy? And some days I feel really sad, but that doesn't mean I don't have joy. That doesn't mean I don't have
Right.
hope. It's just a feeling. And how did you wrestle those feelings? And how did you teach your kids, hey, those feelings are normal and they're welcome, but we don't stay there, and but we have to go through it. Like you can't, there's no way to skirt around facing this kind of grief. How'd you parent through that?
Well, we were really consistent in reading the Bible and going to church, and we one of the things that we did, as I did early on, was we talked about my husband. We
Mhm.
didn't I've heard stories where people just can't do that. But we, from the very beginning, we talked about daddy, what he would have done in this situation, what he would have thought about what we were doing, if he would agreed or if
Mhm.
he would. And so we cherish the memories of him, and we laugh about some of the things he did. I've told them stories about things he did in growing up and things he did in college. So they know their dad because of those
Mm.
stories. And so that I think that's been really critical for us
Yeah.
to be able to remember. And so
Mhm.
we still do. We still remember. And now my youngest is 17, and he's the most like his dad. He reminds me so much of him. He has kind of the same sense of humor.
Yeah.
And so I'll tell him things like that because he won't remember. And then my middle son's in college, and his dad was a KA in that
Mm.
fraternity, and so Garrett has also joined the same fraternity, and so I shared some of his items from when he was in college and some of the
Mm.
stories that whether I probably should have or not, because his dad was a little bit of a wild one in college. But anyway, I didn't know him then, of course, but just keeping him top of mind, we never
Mhm.
skirt around talking about him. And so it's
Yeah.
just natural for us to do
Mhm.
that. So I think that if I did anything good, I think that's probably it, so that they know him. One of the things I did too that I was proud of, and at the time they probably weren't like excited about it, but I made them each a book using a photo app,
Mhm.
and each of them have their own book of their pictures with their dad. Some family pictures are in there, but it's each son has his own book. And of course, Connor, my oldest, is has the most pictures because he was with him the
Yeah.
longest, of course, but so that's something that they'll always be able to see and remember their dad like that too, so
Mhm. I love that. How did you see God show up in the midst of this deep grief and this journey into single parenting these three boys?
I learned a lot from my boys, and I just want to share a story from my youngest. All of them have taught me so much, but one of the things that my example I usually share is with my youngest is it's okay to cry out to God. Once he asked his older brother, "Why did God send the ants?" And my middle son said, with his 5-year-old wisdom, he said, "You know that God can hear you. He can hear you in Disney World." So then my youngest, in his deep, raspy voice, said, "God, why did you send the ants?" And that just reminds us that God already knows what's in our hearts, and it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to cry out to him. And so he, in his own way, in his own bold way, did just that.
Yeah.
And I just love that.
Mm-hmm.
There's another story I want to tell you, and this is not a funny one, but about 3 weeks after my husband died, I had to go get the death certificate from the funeral home. And while I was there, they said, "Well, do you want to take his ashes too?" I'm like, I hadn't even thought about it. So I'm
Mm.
sitting in my car with a death certificate in my hand and his ashes beside me, and I just completely lost it. And then I went on to read the death certificate, and it told me that, it lists all the causes of death, and which diabetes being one of them. And I thought, well, that's not what they said at the hospital. So it just really shook me to my core because I was like, what in that case, what should I have done differently? We were supposed to go see a specialist like the next week and we didn't get there. And so I was having all this guilt because of that. And
Sure.
so in that moment, I remember crying out to God, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, in my spirit, God said to me, are you going to trust me in this? And said, I don't know what else to do but to trust you. But God's presence was very real to me in that moment. And it has been, of course, through all these years. But to have God remind me that I can still trust him. It's not about what I can handle or not handle. It's about trusting him to take care of the details. So that's how I saw God that day, and of course many times since then.
Which has
That's it.
led you to another book. So tell
Yes.
us about your second book.
My second book, the idea came about in the middle of writing the first book. And so I just sat on it for a while. But I wanted to talk about how God's presence is with us because again, you just mentioned it and I experienced God's presence through this trial. But I wanted to be able to share how he is with us all the time.
Yeah.
And so I'd been talking with some different people and I ended up with about 12 different stories from others about how God showed up in their lives in different circumstances. And so that's what I did. I interviewed people and I shared some of our stories as well. And my boys are in it as well. And they've had to review it because I didn't want to do anything that they wouldn't agree to. But
Right.
they have been so supportive. They have been so supportive. So I'm
Mhm.
blessed by that. But that's where it came from is just sharing what others have experienced. And it's not about just the big things, the miracles that we see happen. It's about God being in the little parts of our day, or sometimes it's
Mhm.
big, but God showing up. One of my favorite stories in there is a friend of mine who was divorced. Her husband was a serial cheater, and she'd been divorced for 20 years. It all happened for the whole marriage, but she'd been divorced for 20 years, and she still was lived life a bitter, without joy type of person. Just
Yeah.
it consumed her, and she ended up in a hospital during the COVID for 200 and I think 14 days.
Wow.
Yeah, she almost died. They didn't expect her to live, but while she was there, God spoke to her and told her she needed to forgive her ex-husband and to tell him
Mm.
she loved him. And she's, no way.
Yeah, not happening.
Not happening.
I don't blame
But she says that lying in a hospital room with no one could see her, she couldn't have family and friends in there.
Yeah.
She's she got a different perspective. And so she did what God asked her to do. And she said that in that moment, he didn't answer the phone. She had to leave a voice message. But in that moment that she did that, she felt complete freedom. That is the power of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And God released her from years of bitterness and hatred. And she will tell you that in that very moment, her life was different. She
Mm.
had joy again. She had a desire to live and to grow and to serve other people again. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the stories in there. And I love it because of the transformation that God gives and because of the healing that forgiveness provides when we choose to
Mhm.
do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that wasn't something she wanted to do, but the obedience that she followed
Yes.
and the prompting to, okay, this is what I need to do. And then the freedom that she found. What do you say to the mom who's listening who is maybe in the thick of something like this? And maybe it's not the loss of a husband, maybe it is a divorce, it's some sort of loss. Like you mentioned you had multiple miscarriages and then you had a daughter that passed away. What do you say to the mom who's, hey, this is great and I'm great that y'all see God in all the things and you're talking about having joy amongst sorrow, but I just don't think I'm ever going to feel whole again. What encouragement, Patricia, would you share with her?
I would say too, I'm all facing loss. It doesn't have to be death of a spouse. It could be the loss of a relationship. It could be the loss of a job or even the loss of a dream. But Jesus is that common denominator. Because of him, we can have joy through trials and disappointments. Because of him, we can overcome because he's by our side.
Mhm.
And because of him, let his presence transform us. Because if we will, again, be obedient like my friend or open, he will do the transformation. Now, one of the things happened when my ex husband left, he was having an affair. That ended that. But I remember during that time after he left, God used that time to change me. I drew closer to the Lord. I began to be consistent about my Bible study and my prayer time, and God changed me. I became a person who was dependent on another person in the relationship to a person who was confident in herself because of who she had with the Lord.
Yeah.
And so I was changed. And then 7 years later, again, we don't know how God is always working behind the scenes, but 7 years later, I got a phone call from the other person in the relationship, in the affair, who called to tell me that she had given her life to the Lord and she was calling me to ask for my forgiveness in her part in breaking up my marriage.
Wow.
Now, that took a lot of courage. And I was honestly able to tell her that I had forgiven her years ago because, again, God had worked in my life and that I was glad that she had come to know the Lord and that I was happy that, and I thanked her for calling me. But because of something terrible that happened, God
Mhm.
changed me. I was not the same person I'd been, and God
Yeah.
changed her, and she was not the same person she'd been either. So
Mhm.
that's what God can do and will do if we will allow Him to work like that. I would just also encourage women, moms, to remember that He is in our challenges. He's in the big stuff. He's in the small stuff. He's in the everyday moments of our
Mm.
lives. A lot of times we look at the gifts of healing or the miraculous
Yeah.
instead of looking at the Spirit's ordinary work of
Mm.
giving peace, joy, and hope in our lives. And so I would encourage us not to overlook that because He is the light in our darkness.
Mm. That's such a great encouragement. I close out every episode with asking, is there something specific that you're praying for that we could join you in prayer? And do you have a favorite scripture that you would share with the listeners?
Okay. My favorite scripture is John 10:10. And of course, the first part of that verse says that Satan has come to kill, steal, and destroy. And that depicts our lives many times. We feel beaten down, discouraged, without hope. Our joy is stolen. but Jesus changes everything. He wants us to live a joyful life. And the second part of that verse says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. So he wants us to have that life.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's I probably should have started with, it's heavy on my heart because I have a dear friend who just passed away this morning from cancer that we only knew about less than a month ago. But the upside of that is that she is now in the presence of Jesus. And so she can have that the fullest life. I remember people saying that about Matthew when he passed away, that he was a man that was full of life, big T's, life of the party kind of guy, always having fun. And we talked about how that was nothing compared to what he was experiencing with the Lord. And he came that we may have life and not to live. It doesn't mean that we won't be in a bad place in our lives, but we don't stay there.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, trouble will come. That will happen, most definitely. But we don't have to stay there because he's come that we may have life and have it to the full.
Yeah, such a good reminder.
Look.
I'm sorry about the loss of your friend.
Thank you.
We will definitely include her and her family and you in our prayers as y'all navigate this next journey of difficulty. Scripture doesn't say that if you have troubles, it says when.
When. Yeah.
When. And your advice and your encouragement to stay connected to your faith and to make that the bedrock of whatever you're facing is such a good reminder and encouragement for all of us. And I love that this next book is going to point out all the ways of us opening our eyes and being aware of God's presence in the little things and in the big things. We don't want to wait until we're so desperate for God to finally call out to God. He's going to show up in our desperation, but it's also very comforting whenever we establish that relationship, which was told so well by your middle son when he said, God's even at Disney. And big brother ministering to little brother, like, you can ask him about the ants. And so as moms, teaching our kids that, hey, you know what? God's in your curiosity too. And it's okay to ask all the questions is such a great reminder.
Hey, one more quick story about my son. We just got a new dog. And so we had an old dog, we had a new dog, and my youngest is sitting in between them on the floor. He's like, I feel surrounded by joy. And that was so simple, but everything he needed was right. Give him joy was right there. And everything we need to give us joy is right within our reach. Will us only receive it.
Yeah. Out of the mouth of babes.
That's right. That's right.
What a good reminder. What a good reminder. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your encouragement. I appreciate it. And I know the listeners are going to be so blessed.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thanks so much for listening to The Mom Show with Courtney Doyle. Remember to check the show notes for any links, books, or resources that are mentioned in each episode. We want to be sure this blesses other mothers. And in order to do this, if you're listening via podcast, be sure that you like and share. If you could write a review, that would be fantastic. It helps us get in front of other moms. If you're watching via YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. This way, you won't ever miss an episode. We want to make sure that we increase our reach to other mothers who need a little encouragement, a community, and a whole lot of Jesus. We're so glad you're here.